So today I am demonstrating the 4 seam samples of the first segment, which will be the straight seam, the French seam, the corner seam, as well as the dart. And so I have 8" by 4" blocked rectangles. These have already been pressed. My muslin is curling a little bit. And I am going to take 2 pieces of fabric for my first seam sample, which will be the straight seam. And so I'm going to place these together, lining up the edges. And as you can see, I've already drawn a line. This is my grain line, but it's also my 1/2" seam allowance. So I'm going to use my clear graph ruler and line it up with the edge of the fabric. And so I'm not lining up that 1/2" line with the edge of the fray, but rather the bit of the fabric that has not yet been affected by that disintegration of the fiber. So I'm going to go ahead and draw over that line, just darken it a little bit. And this is going to establish my stitch line and my seam allowance. The stitch line is where you are placing your stitches, and the seam allowance is the amount of material going towards the body, really holding that garment together. And so I have a needle and thread. I'm working with a single length. I'm working with embroidery floss today, so that's a little bit thicker and darker. And I'm going to begin stitching on that stitch line. And really, I'm just doing a running stitch. And I'm keeping my stitches right on top of my pencil line so I have some control over this seam and ensuring that it is straight. I'm not worried about these loose threads. We don't have to worry about any finishings for these edges. Okay, I'm going to tie an overhand knot at the base of my cloth. Double knot, I can snip and continue. When I open up my seam sample, and I'm going to label this my straight seam, you can see that my stitch line is completely straight, and theoretically this would be the interior of my garment. So I'm going to go ahead and finger press before I take it over the iron, and make sure that when you are pressing that your seam is not lapped. So none of it is overhanging particularly to one side. You actually do want to be able to see those stitches in between, and that's how you'll know it is perfectly flat and clean. And so on this outside, same thing. I can see the little tick marks from my stitches, but I don't have either edge overhanging the other. And so this is your straight seam. I'm going to go ahead and label that. And after you press it, it can remain like this as an example in your sketchbook. I'm going to move on to my next seam sample. So here I have 2 pieces of cloth, and we are going to do a corner. And so I'm going to line up my ruler again with the edge of the material and establish a 1/2 inch stitch line from the edge along the length. Now I'm going to rotate it, and I'm going to do the exact same thing with the corner. So I have a perfect right angle, and now I'm going to go ahead and begin stitching on my stitch line again. And again, we're just using the running stitch. When I get to the corner, on a machine, I would have to make sure my needle is inserted right at that point, but I'm going to do the exact same thing. So with hand sewing, I'm going to insert my needle, and you can rotate the material to make it more convenient for you. And I'm going to come up fairly close to that corner and begin sewing down the width of my seam sample. So I'm continuing, and I'm going to tie a double overhand knot. When I have finished this seam sample, I'm going to snip my thread, and I'm going to turn it inside out. But the thing with the corner and using a 1/2 inch seam allowance is that creates a lot of bulk within the seam. And so one thing I can do is I can carefully, before flipping it, finger press that corner right on the stitch line. So I have my stitch here. I'm going to do the same thing here. And so I've created a really neat corner. It's very strong, it's very pointy to the touch. And I'm going to go inside my seam sample and grip the exterior of that fold as well as the interior of the corner and push it all the way through as I turn the corner. So that is one way of creating a corner seam without cutting the corner that has a lot of integrity. And so one thing that happens often, a little bit of pressing will take care of that, with clipping the corner, is that you lose some of that integrity in the corner, and your seam sample, when it's a little off, should be a perfectly right angle. Another thing that you can do, and then I'll take this to the iron, I'll press this completely flat, and that will allow me to press right on that stitch line, and I'll do the same thing for this side and get as close to that point as I possibly can. And here, it's very close to a right angle. What I can also do is flip it inside out if that doesn't work for you, the folding method, and snip it about 1/8 of an inch away from that corner on the diagonal. But then I do the exact same thing. I'm going to fold it in, grip it, and this will take away some of the bulk of that material. You can also gently use the tip of your scissors to promote that corner to sharpen. And you just have to be careful because you don't want, there you go, poke all the way through your corner. Not gentle enough. Okay, and so you'll take this over to the iron as well, clean it up, and this is your corner. The next technique that we will do is a French seam. And so to begin my French seam, I'm going to draw a pattern on my fabric to suggest the right side. So I'm going to draw some flowers here and here. And this will indicate that this is the right side of my fabric and that this is the wrong side. And so a French seam is a perfectly enclosed seam that needs no other finishing. So it'll never need a serger or pinked edges or a baby hem, or turn and fold, anything that you can think of that another seam finishing would require. The French seam is perfectly encapsulated. It also takes more steps and more time, which makes it traditionally more expensive and will increase the price of a garment. If I were to sew a straight seam, I would simply fold my pieces so that the right sides face together. This would create my stitch line, and when I would open it up, my garment would look like this, with the right sides facing outward, the wrong sides facing inward, my seam on the inside. A French seam really starts backwards, so I'm going to place the wrong sides together with the right sides showing face up. Thread my needle. And I'm going to work with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but this time, instead of stitching at the 1/2 inch line, I know that 1/2 inch is my total. I'm going to have to divide that by half and sew at 1/4 inch. So I'm lining these two up together, taking my ruler and lining up the edge of my fabric with 1/4 inch. So that creates my stitch line. And now I'm going to begin a running stitch on top of that established pencil line. So I'm going to do my last stitch, tie an overhand knot. Snip my thread. My next step is going to be trimming this. So I had a 1/2 inch seam allowance, or I'm sorry, 1/4 inch seam allowance initially. I'm going to trim it down and remove all of those threads, but trim it down to 1/8 inch away from that stitch line. And So remove that. Now I'm going to open up my fabric and I'm going to finger press my seam allowance to one side. I'm just going to go ahead and start initially folding. If you're standing at an iron, I highly recommend you iron and then bring it back. And so I've pressed it to one side. I'm now going to place it right on the fold and finger press again so that I don't have any fabric overhanging one side. So really just gently promote it with your fingertips right to that edge. And again, I'm going to trace now 1/4 inch away from my stitch line. So I've established 1/4 inch, and so plus that original 1/4 inch, we are totaling at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, I will do a running stitch on my pencil line.